Okay, cool. I will start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last day of Shout Festival. Today, we're joined by Kevin Walker, who is the author of this fantastic book here, Queer Folk Tales. I'm going to hand over to Kevin now to introduce himself and to do a bit of a reading for you all. Let me unmute you, Kevin. Or can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, that's it. Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's really kind of you to come along and to hear a few tales from my new book. I'm saying my new book. It's my first book, actually. So I've been working as a storyteller for 20 years, working with children and teenagers and adults. And over the last few years, until the last performance piece, were queer tales. So I thought, let's get them down, let's get them written. So it's a brand new skill for me to actually write them down. And it's great to get together with you tonight and read a few. Now, there aren't many traditional tales that have got a queer background to them, as you'll appreciate. Very, very few indeed. There's some tales that maybe have women cutting off their hair and disguising themselves as soldiers, and they go off to find their man in battle to either bring him home or to humiliate him. But when the job is done, they grow their hair back and they become, there's tales where drunken men are turned into women, but that's mainly to show them how women want to be treated. And once again, they've learnt their lesson, they turn back to being a man again. So very, very few stories have anything to do with queerness. So I've had to adapt and change and use stories that I know could have a little bit of queerness in. And so in this book, there are 15 stories, and each of the story at their very center. And so some of the stories are traditional type and some of them are modern stories, but I've tried to write them in a traditional style. So stories that have a little bit of magic in them.
There's no doubt that Wendy and Graham and the whole family have been devastated.
Kevin, you've been muted. Sorry about that, everyone. Kevin.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, you're good now. Sorry about that.
They heard everything else though.
They heard, so I'd go back to the previous sentence, but we heard.
What was I saying? Oh yes, so the new stories that I've written have a traditional sort of format. So for me, traditional stories have maybe a little bit of magic in them. They maybe have a journey that somebody has to take, somewhere they have to make decisions, or maybe they meet someone who changes their life, or they have some sort of transformation. So I'm going to start off with, I've got 2 stories to read tonight. And what I did was I went to my friends on Facebook and said, which ones do you think I ought to read? And these are the ones they chose. So they're not the ones I would have chosen, but they're the ones that are becoming popular at the moment. So the first one, and sorry, I've not talked to many people. I don't know about you, we've been in lockdown. I don't get a chance to talk to many people. So the old voice has gone up to tea. So the first story is a modern story. And I hope you enjoy it. It's called The Watch. Anita ripped the earphones out and fumbling, she switched off the music and stuffed everything deep into the pockets of her black, heavy woolen overcoat. She smiled and nodded apologetically to the others who were sitting in the waiting room. Obviously, her loud, if muffled music had made them all turn to look at her. She made her way to an empty chair and sat down, wishing that she had not made such an entrance. After a while, she ventured a quick look at all the other people in the room, mostly couples. Why was she always faced with couples? She sneered inwardly. She couldn't help returning to it, but she would have been sitting as part of a couple if it hadn't been for the love of her life. She couldn't help still being bitter after all these years. They'd met at university, were an odd couple, but somehow they seemed to fit together. After graduating, they decided to set up home together, talked about plans for the future, a business, maybe even a family. And then she used his laptop one night, discovered what he was looking at, why he spent so much time working on it. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it, confessed to everything and more, went upstairs, packed his bags, said he was sorry, and then went. She'd been left in a daze with no opportunity to talk to him about it, stunned with the speed of this. He was gone from her life. Life became grim without him. Anita's plans for a career in theatre went out of the window. The wind knocked totally out of her sails. Instead, she went down the temping route. Grim indeed. Most of her work was in the city, and she was good at what she did, so work was constant. She began to neglect herself, had no social life, ate poorly and drank. And that was how she had met dear George. She wondered if he had known that he probably, literally, had saved her life. Dear George. She'd got into the habit of calling in at a wine bar near the station on her way home from work. She sat in the window, her earphones in, listening to tracks from her beloved musicals, with a large glasses of wine, and one furtive eye on the clock so that she didn't miss her train home. Olives and peanuts became her evening meal. One evening she was sitting on her usual stool, miles away in her music, when she noticed a man standing next to her, miming an enquiry about whether the stool next to hers was free. She nodded and carried on listening to her music, but then, feeling a tinge of guilt at her rudeness, removed the earphones and said, "Oh, sorry, that was rude of me. I just get so engrossed." He raised his hand. No problem, no problem. Don't let me disturb you. But his smile captivated her. Pushing her phone and earphones deep into her pockets, she finished off her wine and said, "I'm Anita. I have to dash in a minute, train to catch." "Ah, I see," said George. "Don't let me stop you." He proffered his hand. "I'm George." They shook hands and she noticed that he was older than she had first thought. It's a lovely smile and kind eyes. He stood when she stood. Wow. A few nights later, George appeared by her seat again. "Hello again," he said. "I'm a little earlier tonight. Are you here every night?" Her eyes opened wide, but then she realized he was teasing her when his face broke into a huge, wide, crinkly grin. "Please, can I get you another wine?" It seemed rude not to say yes. And so began their relationship. She was in there every night, and he appeared most nights too. They sat together, talked easily about music, theatre, the weather, life. They drank wine together, laughed and became friends. But they never talked about their personal lives or asked each other personal questions. She had noticed that George wore a wedding ring, and she picked up from various things he had said that he had only recently married and to someone much younger. But she didn't need to know anymore, and she certainly didn't want to tell him her story about Matthew, because even though it had been a couple of years, there had been no other man. One evening, he was there before her. He waved over to her and she joined him on the stool, glass of red wine. They had become kiss on the cheek type friends, but everything was proper. George was a gentleman, so she was taken quite by surprise when he said that he had something for her, and he gave her a small, slim box. She frowned at him questioningly, but he said, oh, it's nothing much, honestly. She opened the box to find a rather funky and very on-trend purple watch. I noticed how often you have to look at the clock so you don't miss your train. I thought this might help. She laughed. I haven't owned a watch for years, but this is too much. He explained that he owned a jeweller's shop and that there were some watches that he had overordered. It's not an expensive one, don't worry. Not that I'm cheap. They both laughed at that. It was on the same evening that George said he had a question that he hoped she wouldn't mind him asking her. She grimaced. No, don't worry. It's actually a bit of a confession, really. I'm worried that I've been drinking a little too much recently. There's a nice cafe over the road, and I think I ought to frequent it more, rather than this delightful wine bar. But I wondered if we could still meet there. Anita enjoyed their evening get-togethers, and so she happily agreed. It was only later that she realised that George was really thinking of her. He noticed that she was drinking a lot, and had guessed she probably wasn't eating too well either. This simple ploy of changing venue enabled them to drink coffee, water or fruit juices, and eat something too. She still enjoyed their meetings and made a point of checking her beautiful purple watch every now and again, but realised their friendship was just that, a friendship. Her friendship with George had begun to affect Anita in positive ways. She wasn't drinking as much, was eating a little better, but also she'd begun to take better care of herself and her appearance, and to think of the future. One evening she arrived early. She waited, looking occasionally at her beautiful watch, dying for him to arrive, as she had a little gift for him. But he never came. Obviously, one of the days when he didn't have to come up to town. The next evening, she arrived first again, but this time the waiter came over to her and spoke to her gently. He knew George because his jeweller's shop was just around the corner. He told her that George had suffered a heart attack and had not survived. Dear George, if only he'd known what an effect he'd had on her. And now in the waiting room, she looked at the purple watch, which she had discovered much later was in fact an expensive bit of kit, and smiled and thought of him. The coldness of grief that had welled over her was gone, and now, because of him, she was stronger and capable of facing many things. Anita realised there were more folk waiting in the room with her, all dressed in black, and she scanned the room, wondering who they were and how they had known him. The door opened and everyone stood up, looking towards the door. She turned, and there was Matthew. Matthew, after all these years. He came into the room and everyone smiled sympathetically and nodded, acknowledging his grief. The undertaker appeared and moved forward, hand outstretched. Matthew reached out to take the undertaker's hand with both of his, and as he did so, Anita noticed his pale wrist against the black sleeve of his morning suit. He was wearing a large purple watch. I'm very sorry for the loss of your husband, Matthew, but all your friends are here to support you.
Woo!
Woo! Thank you. Oh, yeah. So that's the first story. So as you can see, it's a modern story. I wrote it actually because my husband, he used to come along to my storytelling, and he always used to say, why don't storytellers tell stories about computers or cars or watches? They always tell stories about kings or emperors or goddesses, and his head used to hit the chair in front of him when the storyteller said, once upon a time there was a king. So I wrote that for him, the watch. So yeah, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that, or I hope you enjoyed it anyway. So we'll go on to the next one, and this one I've based on a traditional story, a very well-known story called The Blue Rose. It's been around forever. And when I wrote this book, I didn't want to just regender stories. I felt that was a little bit of a cop-out, too easy. But this is one of them, well, the only one, which I did actually just regender. And for me, it works even more powerfully. So I hope you enjoy this. It's called The Blue Rose. Let me have a swig again. Honestly, this is not gin, it's water. The old emperor was becoming weary of this world. The burden of his years weighed heavily on his shoulders, and he was ready to join his dearly beloved wife in the afterlife. He had worked hard to make China a happy and prosperous nation. His eldest son was married and already had sons of his own. The lineage would continue. He had only one last wish: to see his younger daughter settled and married. As any good parent knows, one should never have favourites, but he did love this young woman. She was fierce and brave, beautiful and educated, and they spent many happy times together playing chess while discussing philosophy and religion. And so it was, with her blessing, that he decided to find her someone. An official decree was sent out saying that the empress family were looking for the perfect match for the princess. Someone who could bring joy to her life, someone who would feel able to join the royal family. Suitors were to come to the palace to ask the emperor for the hand of the princess. But they must also present her with a perfect blue rose. Many sat up when they first heard the proclamation. Who wouldn't want a family, but a blue rose? China was the land of the rose, but whoever had heard of a blue one? The Chancellor saw his chance to become a permanent part of the dynasty. And so straight away, he approached a successful merchant whom he knew could source most items. The merchant listened to the request and said it would be no problem. If it is available, I can lay my hands on it. But it will take me 3 days to procure such an unusual item. The Chancellor was anxious as to whether someone else would swoop in more quickly, but he realised it was an unusually difficult merchandise and grudgingly agreed. The following morning, during the usual hustle and bustle of the Emperor's throne room, after all the petitions and requests and arguments had been dealt with, the Chancellor was horrified to see the captain of the guard step forward, bow low to the Emperor, and formally announce, "Your Majesty, I have come to ask for the hand of your daughter." And in his hand, he held something covered by a silk scarf. The captain of the guard, a brusque man, accustomed to getting his own way, had also decided the princess and all that came with her would be his. The night before, he and 12 armed men had saddled their horses and galloped for the border into a little country that neighboured China. The captain had once worked for the young king of this country and knew that he was not a lover of confrontation. More importantly, he knew the king was a collector of fine artifacts, and if anyone possessed a blue rose, then surely he would. The captain stood before the young man and made his demands. The royal guard stepped forward to protect their king, but he held up his hand to stop them, signalled to his chief minister, whispered in his ear, and the minister bustled away. The two men had once been lovers, but had parted on bad terms. Now the king was aware of the captain's subtle threat to expose their secret. There was an awkward silence as the young king simply smiled at the captain. And eventually the chief minister came back with something balanced on his hand, covered with a silk scarf. Here, you served me well, and although I don't appreciate your veiled demands, this may be what you are searching for. Now, back in the Emperor's palace, the captain pulled away the scarf with a flourish. There, in the palm of his hand, was a beautifully carved sapphire rose. The palace onlookers gasped with astonishment. The Chancellor groaned. The Emperor signalled to his daughter, who carefully lifted the blue rose from the captain's hand. She felt the weight. She held it to the light. She covered it with her other hand and smiled. I thank you for your marriage proposal and for this beautiful blue rose. But I'm afraid for me it's not perfect. This rose is skillfully carved and has an enchanting hue of blue, but it's merely a hard rock fashioned by a craftsman. I look for something softer, gentler. She bowed low. The captain of the guard was furious and looked at the Emperor, but the Emperor simply shrugged. It's my daughter's decision. The captain turned and strode out, and the Chancellor sighed with relief. But he wasted no time. And the next morning, he rushed to the merchant to demand that he find a blue rose by the next day. Of course, said the merchant, when have I ever let you down? That very morning, again after the noisy business of the throne room, the keeper of the royal treasures stepped forward. The Chancellor slapped his head. Your Majesty, I have come to ask for the hand of the princess in marriage. Again, the Emperor signalled to his daughter, who stepped forward and bowed. And the blue rose? Now, the keeper of the royal treasures really did love the princess and had observed her many times around the palace. He felt that he knew her well and had found something that he was sure would captivate her. He knew that the princess loved tea, and he proudly presented her with a beautifully delicate white bone china tea bowl with a transparent rose outline painted on it. As the princess held the bowl carefully, he quietly clapped his hands, and a servant came forward with a teapot. As the hot liquid filled the bowl, the onlookers gasped as the outline of the rose turned blue. The princess looked at the bowl and sipped the tea. And as the liquid drained from it, the bowl cooled and the blue rose gradually faded. She again bowed and said, I thank you for your marriage proposal and for this beautiful blue rose, but I am afraid for me it's not perfect. The blue rose was delightful in the heat of the moment, but it faded in the shortest time. I search for a blue rose that will never fade. She bowed low once again. The keeper of the royal treasures held his head high and strode out of the room. The Chancellor sighed with relief. His wife found him doubled over with his hands over his face, weeping. Whatever is the matter, my husband? He told her the whole story, promising to find a blue rose for the Chancellor, and that he was coming the next day, expecting to have found one, and how, for the first time, he had failed in his endeavours. His wife thought for a moment and then said, go to the apothecary. He is a man of science and magic. Surely he can help. And so he did. The apothecary smiled and went to the shelves at the back of his little shop and came back with a little vial of red liquid. Take this vial home, but be careful. It is deadly poison. Choose a white on stem and carefully place the cut stem in this liquid. The rose will drink the red poison, and in doing so, by the laws of nature, it will poison its system and turn the opening rose blue. The merchant was astounded by the knowledge of the apothecary and gratefully paid him. He went home and with the help of his wife, he carefully prepared the experiment. To their amazement, next morning, just before the Chancellor was due to arrive, the rose turned blue. The Chancellor was delighted and paid the merchant well. He did notice that the merchant was being careful how he handled the rose and that he wound a silk scarf around the bottom of the stem to cover the poisonous thorns, to make it easier for the Chancellor to carry it. The Chancellor hurried to the palace and arrived just as the court business was coming to an end. "Your Majesty, I have come to ask for the hand of the princess in marriage." The Emperor beckoned to his daughter, who dutifully stepped forward and bowed. "And the blue rose?" asked the Emperor. The Chancellor, with obvious care, produced the blue rose and from behind his back and gave it to the princess, making sure she took it by the part of the stem wrapped in the silk scarf. She held it at arm's length and looked at the strange flower. The red poison had worked its magic so well that the stem, complete with the leaves, had turned blue too. The princess looked at the rose, but not wanting to offend her father's dear and loyal Chancellor, said, "I thank you for your marriage proposal and for this beautiful blue rose, but I'm afraid for me it's not perfect." A few dead leaves fell from the rose as she spoke. "This rose has no perfume on its bloom, and its life will be short. I crave something more pleasing in fragrance, long-lasting and more natural to me." The Chancellor nodded his head to her and then to his Emperor, and bravely took his usual place just behind the Emperor's throne. The search for the blue rose had made big news throughout the country. By now, many visitors had made their way to the palace to see the fun when the princess made her choice. Street vendors and entertainers had set up in the city to entertain and make money from the visiting crowds. The whole city was open to the night. But that night, when the noise had begun to quieten, a musician from a troupe of actors began to play delicious music. The delightful sound filled the air, and everyone fell silent to listen to this beautiful lilting sound. The princess, in her apartment, just above where the entertainers had set up camp, came to a window to listen, and the music struck a chord in her heart. She made her way down her private stairs and hid in the shadows of the high palace walls, watching and listening to this accomplished musician moved expert fingers over the strings to make such exquisite music. When at last the music faded and the silence seemed to make the whole world sigh, she beckoned from the shadows to the musician to follow her up the stairs. That night, they made sweet music together. Before the sun began to rise, she whispered into the ear of the musician, and as the day broke, too soon, she was once again alone in her bed. That morning, after the usual hustle and bustle of the court business had just been completed, a simply dressed musician stepped forward and stood before the Emperor. All went quiet as the court and the Emperor waited for her to state her business. She put her instrument bag on the ground, bowed and said, "Your Majesty, I have come to ask for the hand of your daughter in marriage." The silence in the throne room was deafening. The Emperor beckoned his daughter forward and she bowed low. "And the blue rose?" asked the Emperor. The young musician bent down and opened her bag and produced a long-stemmed white rose. which she had picked from the emperor's own garden before entering the palace. She gave it to the princess and bowed low again. The princess took the rose and held it in her hands. She held it close to her face and smelled its perfume and felt its soft petals against her cheek. She rotated it in her hands to look at it more closely and pricked her finger on one of the thorns. She smiled and licked the little dot of blood from her skin. She sighed. I thank you for your marriage proposal and for this beautiful rose. It is the most beautiful blue rose I have ever seen. If you will have me, I will gladly accept your proposal. There was uproar in the throne room. The Chancellor, the Keeper of the Royal Treasures, and the Captain of the Guard all angrily stepped forward, shouting along with the rest. But the Emperor quickly stood and with a gesture of his hand silenced them all. Well, nearly. The three angry ex-suitors still managed to mumble, "It's not blue, not a noble birth, not even a man." But the Emperor silenced them. My daughter has made her decision. She has decided that this is the most perfect blue rose that she had ever seen. Who am I? Who are we to contradict her opinion, her choice? He smiled at his daughter and declared, I am in total agreement with my daughter, and I can see that this will be a wonderful marriage of like minds. Let us all prepare to celebrate and be joyful. And celebrate they did. The marriage day was filled with joy and laughter, and crowds turned out to see the Emperor's daughter joined with her perfect blue rose. When the celebrations were at last over, the happy couple slipped away to start a new life together in a little blue palace down by the side of the sea. They lived there happily ever after, and I'm sure they made sweet music together for many years. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that one. So that was more of a traditional type tale, obviously. There are others there. I've even done The Three Little Pigs, Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, queered them up. So taking some very traditional ones and then some extremely modern ones too as well. So I hope you enjoyed the stories from Queer Folk Tales. I hope you might consider going out and buying it. I know some of you have already. I can recognise a few faces. So thank you for coming along tonight. And Rico's got a copy.
I do.
Yay! So get it from all bookshops. And thank you very much for listening to us tonight.
So I've just got a couple of questions for you before we go, and there's a couple of questions from the audience, I believe. After years of telling stories, how did you find the process of writing queer folk tales?
It was very different, very, very different. I obviously had to learn a whole new set of skills, because when you're a storyteller, well, all storytellers have different ways of remembering their stories, but mine is to simply write down a couple of things like names and dates and phrases I might want to use again, and then I just rehearse and rehearse. And on performance night, it comes out differently every time. So if you're telling a story and you can see a group of people are reacting to one little bit more than the others, you can actually turn your storytelling to them to make the rest of the audience laugh or grimace. Or if there's a blast of wind outside, you can bring it into your story. But when you're writing, of course, it has to be perfect every time for whoever's reading it. And you've got to make sure that with no facial gestures, no hand gestures, no body, people have to get your story. So yeah, a very different prospect. And I never thought that anybody would publish it. In fact, to begin with, I went down the self-publishing route. And so I was preparing to self-publish. And then I thought, oh, why not? I'll enter it to the History Press, who's the publisher. And they, bless them, they snapped my hand off. And so they got along and they published it. And the rest is history.
Yeah. How did you select the stories that you chose in the end?
For these, Well,
were there any
the
that make
last,
the cut?
yeah, the last story telling performance that I did was a thing called Fairy Wanting to Meet Unicorn, a set of queer stories. And I got together quite a few stories, and the first time I performed it, I did all 10 stories. Now, some of these stories last 15 minutes, 20 minutes, so the audience, bless them, were very patient listening to them all, and they even took part in an after-show discussion, and I got the performance down to 4 stories. So when I went back to writing them down, I'd already got quite a few that I could work on and work them up to being a written performance. But then I sort of just looked around and read more stories and listened and thought about different situations and thought, oh, I could take that and use the story, traditional folktale story way and perhaps write it up. And so there are 15, and they're all very, very different, all very different.
Were there any stories that you chose that didn't make the cut? Any that
There were some that were too late to make the cut. So I've got a ghost story, and I've also got one which I found really interesting. Does anybody know the film Some Like It Hot? Yeah, the one with Jack Lemmon, and it's great. It's a really good story. It's probably from the 50s, the 1950s, and it's basically a story of 2 guys escaping from gangsters, and to escape from them, they dress up as women and join a female band. But during the story, one of them falls in love with the female, I think she's a saxophonist. And so he keeps dressing as a man and taking her out and then having to spend time with her dressed as a woman in the band. But one of the other guys, he stays dressed as a woman, and this very old rich millionaire takes a fancy to him dressed as a woman, and they start having dates. They're being dated, and the very final bit of the film is them driving off in the millionaire's launch, his boat, and the other couple are dressed as man and woman, but he's still dressed as the woman, and they're going off to get married. And the millionaire man, he's quite happy. He knows he's a man dressed as a woman, and they drive off. And you just accept that as part of the film. But when you think about it, it's mind-blowing from the 1950s, isn't it? That everybody was quite happy that very, very popular film, that 2 guys, one dressed as a woman, were going off to get married. So I don't know what next. So I'm still building this collection of stories.
Which is your personal favourite out of all the stories in this book?
I suppose my personal favourite is the very, very first one, because when I was a storyteller, I suddenly realised that nobody, including me, were telling stories that I could actually connect with, because the prince always gets the prince. The 2 sisters always fight over the lovely woodcutter. No prince touches the face of another prince, only in my imagination. So I decided to try it. And I worked on this story called Sikander and the Prince, and tried it out at a few performances, festivals and things, and it got quite a good sort of reaction, and it made people think about it, that there was a possibility. And so yeah, that's my absolute favorite one. It's the first one in the story. It has to be the first one.
That's also my favorite too.
Oh good. Oh, I'm glad you like it. Why do you like it? Do you mind me asking you a question?
Yeah, I like it because I think it's reflective of how expansive the queer community is, especially because it talks about cultural references within queer stories, which I quite like. Yeah, it's my favourite.
Oh, that's good, yeah.
It's quite gentle, and I like gentle queer stories.
It is a very gentle queer story, because all my stories, I try to make it where queerness is just accepted. It's just a part of the stories. You know, so it's just, we're in fairyland, we're in traditional storyland. So let's go with it, folks. Let's not have all the angst. It's how we'd all like the world to be. So I hope you, I'm glad you enjoyed that one. Thanks for watching.
So the last question I have for you is, what's next for Kevin Walker?
I'm going to have pasta and a nice tomato sauce. No, no. Actually, the History Press, who's the publisher that published this book for me, they've actually contracted me to write another collection of short stories. But this time it's going to be very different. It's actually a collection of Buddhist short stories. So it is very, very funny. I'll tell you a quick little story about it. They sent me a draft contract, and I'd asked them to refer back to my last contract that they had, so they got everything the same. And they left a little bit at the bottom by accident, which said, the book, I can't remember the words, but it said, you know, the book had to reference the LGBTQ world, didn't have to, it mentioned all this about gay world. And I said, that's a very niche audience, Buddhist stories for queers. And they had to scribble it out very, very quickly. They got that bit wrong. So yeah, that's next, a collection of Buddhist stories, and that's coming out next June. And they've also commissioned me to, I'm a painter as well, to do all the illustrations and the front cover, which is exciting as well. So it'll be totally my book.
So we've got a question from Noam Bergman. And Noam says, what to you is a modern folk tale as opposed to a short story?
Oh, that's interesting, is that? Yeah, thank you. I think I covered some of it earlier, but I can go over that again. At the moment, I take part in loads of Zoom writing workshops, and most of them are about short story writing. So I've had a lot of experience over the last year, especially. It's been brilliant. There's a great group who's called Out on the Page. If any of you are storytellers and you would like to join it, Out on the Page have all sorts of workshops. And before lockdown, they had physical meetings all over the country, but now they have Zoom lockdowns, so you can get involved in any of them. And in fact, most 4 workshops about writing stories. But yeah, the difference between any short story and a traditional story, a folk story, really, is, like I say, it has to have some sort of magic in it that you accept as well. That's just part of the story. Some sort of journey that the people go on, and that journey usually involves making decisions. So they come to a fork in the road and they have to choose, or they come to several doors and they have to choose. Sometimes they have animals that talk. Sometimes they meet someone that changes their life or makes them think about changing their life. And usually there's some sort of transformation in the story. And it needs to be rememberable as well. Gosh, that's an awful word for a writer, isn't it? Rememberable. You have to remember it as well, because it's, it needs to go down in the annals of folk tales, really. So does that answer your question? Can't see her on the...
I think it does, yeah. So who or what is your favourite queer folk icon?
Yeah. Folk icon?
Who's your favourite queer folk icon?
Let me show you who I've dedicated the book to. I don't know if you can read it.
Mr. Wolf.
To Mr. Wolf. He's oh, bless him. He's always got bad news, hasn't he? But I think he's rather nice, and quite a few of the stories. In fact, one of the other stories in here is The Three Little Pigs, and it's written from the wolf's point of view. And he's actually, he serves at the do-it-yourself centre. So all the pigs come in to the do-it-yourself centre to get stuff to build their house. And he tries to say, twigs, not really good for them, but they all decide what they want to, until the final wolf comes in, and he's looking for somebody grown up and experienced, somebody to give him advice. And as they're talking, there's a little bit of electricity between them. And in the end, the wolf goes up to see him in his fantastic house that's built now of stone and everything. So yeah, the poor dear wolf. And I think quite a few gentlemen in the workshop tonight. Yeah, a nice wolf, hairy chest, lovely teeth, bright eyes, a bit dodgy, Yeah.
So that's 2 questions. How do you pick your source stories?
how do I pick my source stories? It used to be sort of straightforward, because when I was a storyteller, I would get bookings. So a museum or a history site would say, can you find us some stories about? And then I would have to go off and research them and create stories that would be attractive to an audience. When I used to work with children working in schools, oh, goodness me, you go into a primary school and they'd want an hour of stories about farms, an hour of stories about vehicles. Can you do us some stories about making choices? Then in the afternoon, can you do some stories from Egypt? And then after that, can you finish off with the older ones for stories about children in the Second World War, please? And you do it. And then when you got there, they'd say, can you do assembly for us? But now for writing the stories, yeah, I've got to really delve into folk tales. In fact, there's an interesting story for you. A guy who's been researching some fairy tales, we're looking at some fairy tales from Denmark. And he was looking at a Victorian into the early part of the 20th century guy who collected fairy tales from women in the countryside. And he's actually found one which is gay, and it's called The Dog and the Sailor. And if you Google it, he's got together with some artists and they've done a wonderful little film of it as well. So they are beginning to appear, the gay stories, because I'm sure they were there, but Victorian collectors and Christian collectors had got rid of all the stuff that they didn't find acceptable. So I'm sure they are there if we keep looking. Yeah, so I look everywhere. In fact, this might make a great story, mightn't it? Me sitting in front of all these gorgeous people talking to them. That'll be my next story.
So the final question we have is from Charlotte Watson. How do you compare writing short stories to writing novels, and do you prefer writing one to the other?
Now, I haven't tried the novel yet, but I've got this stack of research for a novel that I'm about to start. In fact, if I hadn't got the contract for the Buddhist stories, I would have started. And my story, I'm really excited about it. My story is Icarus and Daedalus. Because when you start looking into Icarus and Daedalus, there's a huge backstory. It starts way, way back before we get to him flying with the wax wings. And so I'm going to write a novel which has the same story told twice. So you'll have a chapter 1A, chapter 1B, chapter 2A, chapter 2B. And one story will be Daedalus, the father's story, and the other side will be Icarus's story, because I think Icarus could be gay. And so we'll see it move along through there. And yeah, I'm quite excited about that. I think probably the difference is that you get almost instant gratification from a short story, because you can rattle one off in an hour, especially if you go into this speed, flash fiction, where you don't write more than 500 words. So you can rattle off a story and then edit it to get rid of all the bits that don't work and the words that you're duplicating and things like that. And you've instantly got something that you can think, wow, I wrote that. Whereas I think a novel, I wonder if I've got the patience for it. Yeah. Do you write novels, Charlotte?
I write. Charlotte, do you write novels?
I don't. I've always wanted to sort of work on my writing a bit more, and as a novice writer, I think, or do I have, going right into thinking, should I write a novel is very like a big thing. So and I like reading short stories more anyway, because like you say, novels they're sometimes harder to get into. Short stories, you get that sort of reward much sooner. Novels, sometimes you have to read the chapters to really get in the flow. Yeah.
If you're reading short stories, if you come across one that you don't like, and I'm sure you will in my book, heaven forbid, you can just skip it, can't you, and go on to the next one, and it doesn't fit, it doesn't spoil the system of reading the whole book. So, I would do it, but try short stories first. And honestly, have a look at Out on the Page and just look to see what they offer. They're really, really good. They run some fantastic workshops. Yeah. In fact, again, I'll tell you a quick little story from that. I was doing the workshop the other day. Oh, I hope he's not listening in, the man. No, he won't be, will he? No. And we were all talking. You get a little bit of time to chat to each other. And he asked the guy who was running the workshop, he said, have you got any websites we can turn to and or anything like that? He said, I've heard of a really good one called Out on the Page. And there was this silence, and everybody's face is going like that, because that's what the workshop was. It was an Out on the Page workshop. And thought, oh no, oh bless him, he's confused. It's the lockdown, I think, isn't it? It's the lockdown.
Yeah, I completely.
Our brains.
Resonate with that completely. Like, I feel like my brain has slowed down significantly just from being on my own all the time. That's all we've got time for today, so we're going to have to wrap up. But thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everyone enjoyed the stories. Please fill out a survey. It's in the chat box. Yeah, and I hope to see you at our next event. And Kevin, do you want to have anything to add?
Yeah, and thank you, Rico, for giving me this chance. You know, it's not often you get a national, platform to promote your new book. So thank you very much. And please, I'm a simple, starving author who needs. No, actually, all the money I make from my writing and from my painting goes off to a dog refuge in Spain. So if you buy the book, you'll be helping dogs as well. Can't guarantee they're queer dogs, but they do help dogs in southern Spain. So there we are. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thank you.